to the Castle House stage. Hi. So many people, so nice. Very excited about the next session. We're going to host Nick Sabine, co-founder, co-CEO of Resident Advisor. Maybe you heard about that. Coach, entrepreneur, purpose-driven leader invites us into a reflection on identity and reinvention. Everything to do with our theme, transform. How to rediscover who you are beyond your brand. So please welcome warmly, Nick Sabine.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much for being a part of this talk. With the theme of transform for this year's conference, I wanted to talk a little bit about the transformation that can happen inside of us when projects that we give so much of ourselves to become successful, and the shifts that can happen that actually long-term have a detrimental impact on our creativity, our vitality, and the impact that we seek to have with the project and the reason we started it in the first place. So I wanted to also talk about, and I'll finish with a bit of insight about a transformation that can happen inside of us to allow us to actually reconnect with the project that we began in a meaningful way and actually allow us to enjoy the thing that we've spent so much of our time, energy, heart contributing towards. Sound good? Okay, let's do this. Okay, a quick question to start. Who here has ever tied their sense of worth or happiness to the success of a creative project or professional pursuit? Okay, I'm glad I'm not alone. For me, that happened to such a degree that I became completely enmeshed with the project that I was responsible for co-creating. And ultimately so much so that not only did I co-create the project, it co-created me. And the question that I, in 2018, failed to answer was this one. Who am I without RA? So RA was the project that I started in 2001, and over time had given so much of myself to it, and unknowingly had given so much of myself to it that I essentially became it in many ways. And it meant that when I asked myself this question, I was unable to come up with a meaningful answer. And so I knew that I had to consciously choose to step away, because if I didn't, I would never be able to answer that question. And that culminated in a moment in the end of March 2021 when I was sat in front of my laptop in my flat on my own, and because it was COVID, I had to give my goodbye speech to my laptop and to a bunch of faces, some with their camera on, some without their camera on. And to say goodbye in such a seemingly inconsequential way to something that I'd given so much of my life to and something that had in many ways shaped me felt very incongruent with how important this thing was to me. And I remember at the end of March, I just closed my laptop and just completely burst into tears and felt completely lost and completely alone. And it was something that I knew I needed to do, and it created the space to allow me to investigate some of the questions that I'll share with you today and invite you to ask yourself. And it also created the space for me to come across some insight which I think is really meaningful and important when we're building projects in the creative space. So how did we get here? So in 2001, I was a 19-year-old music-obsessed kid, and I found a sense of belonging in the electronic music community in Sydney. And so much so that I felt a part of it just as a fan, just to going out to nights, to discovering new music, to discovering new artists. And I realized that I love this thing so much, I asked myself, like, how can I be a part of it? Like, how can I make a contribution to this thing that I've finally, like a place where I finally feel like I belong? And it was that question that actually birthed RA. It was a desire to, like any 17-year-old, I bought turntables. Unfortunately, I wasn't as good a DJ as any of my mates, so I had to scrap that as the path. And I realized that I love writing about music. And so I really wanted to create a place on the internet that could support emerging artists, to help people find the best events, and ultimately a place where many of us could write about music that moved us emotionally and that we could share with other people. And it was never about money. It was something much more important than that. It was about belonging. And it wasn't started to make money. It was just started to make a meaningful contribution to the culture that I'd fallen in love with. And ultimately it was for love. And that was the primary fuel for the entire project in the beginning. And that actually propelled the project for a number of years, until later on I realized that with success comes obligation. And that is actually a very subtle shift that can happen over time. And it can often seem that it's the same sort of passion and the same sort of drive that results in the late nights and the early mornings and the constantly working. And it can seem very similar to the drive that I had it would seem very similar to the drive that I had in the beginning. But there was one major difference, and that difference was, rather than energizing me as I did it, it actually drained me. And I began to realize that I had shifted from beginning this project for love and with love into a place of obligation. And that's obligation to the project, obligation to the team, obligation to the staff, obligation to the mission, and ultimately obligation to the identity that I had created for myself as the co-CEO of this project. And that identity was Nick at RA. At some point in the 2010s, I would have been Nick at RA in 99% of people's phones. And I hadn't realized that I'd actually become that to myself. And in doing so, I'd basically created an internal drift that was masked by external success. And unknowingly, I'd created the conditions to not be able to really enjoy the project as much as I would have loved, because I was driven by obligation rather than love. And so I asked myself this question of, like, what is it costing me to actually lose myself in this project? And ultimately, any meaningful change we seek to make in our life has three critical components. And I realized that they're awareness, intention, and action. And in the awareness phase of this self-exploration, I realized that the awareness was always there. It was just I refused to look at it. It was the fatigue, it was the burnout, it was the loss of joy and flow in the work that I was doing. It was the fact that the work was draining energy rather than giving energy. And on a personal level, it was a divorce. I'd given so much of myself to this. I'd lost myself so much in this project that it had a huge personal consequence. And I realized that the cost is actually huge. And it's a cost that is often hidden. And I knew that I would never truly know the cost until I made a conscious decision to step away. Because I knew that if I never stepped away from the day-to-day running of this project, a project that had shaped much of my adult life, that had given me so much in terms of meaning, in terms of purpose, in terms of identity, I would never, ever be able to answer that question. And obviously it was incredibly scary to step away from this thing that meant so much to me, and ultimately was a source of love for myself as well. Like, I moved towards this thing and wanted to be a part of it because I felt a sense of belonging that growing up as an only child I always sought, and I'd finally found it, and we were doing something that was in service of this community that had given me so much. And so it took a lot of personal courage to consciously make a decision to step away, but I knew that I needed to do it because I also realized that working out of obligation extensively meant that I was also not the best person to lead the project anymore. So that was the intention element, that was the plan to step away. And then the action part. So what was I actually going to do once I decided to step away? And initially it was actually doing nothing. So I realized that I'd never been bored since I was 19. I had given all of myself to this project in a way that every single spare waking moment I devoted to this project. I had no awareness that that's what I was doing. I love music, this is contributing to music, this is supporting independent artists and independent music, this is where I need to be spending my time. And I didn't realize in giving all of myself to that in literally every spare moment. So, being at a festival and before everyone else has woken up, I'm opening up my laptop, answering my emails, having gone to bed like an hour before. Then everyone wakes up, closing the laptop, and then, heading out into the festival. That was like a common behavior of mine. And didn't ever notice that might have been a work addiction or anything like that, but that was just how I operated. And what I realized actually that by creating the space to relate to the project differently, I rediscovered my love for music. I discovered more new music in the first 6 months of stepping away than I had in probably the previous 5 years. And ultimately, I realized that the transformation I was seeking in leaving wasn't so much about actually moving away from the project. It was really about moving back towards myself. And I'd become so fragmented within myself that I had lost my true sense of self, my true alignment, in a way that was draining my energy, as I mentioned, was reducing my vitality. And when I had this realization that it was actually much more about returning to wholeness within myself, I discovered the work of an amazing guy called Jim Dethmer, who actually explores the world of integrity, not through the idea of like a moral good, but rather this idea of wholeness, energetic wholeness. And he has 4 pillars of integrity, which I'll talk through in a sec. But what I realized in actually evaluating my life and my relationship to work and my relationship to RA through this lens of integrity was once I started actually moving back into alignment and actually becoming energetically whole again, I was able to relate to the project in a much more meaningful way. I was able to rediscover the joy of why I began it in the first place. Because I think when we shift to obligation, we actually, at the same time, even though it can seemingly feel like it's driving our performance, obligation is usually in service of the perceived needs of someone else rather than ourselves. Any of you who make music might realize the shift when you start making music for someone else rather than yourself. It has a very different energetic imprint. And what I realized is when I came back to myself through this framework of integrity, I actually rediscovered the vitality, the creativity, the expansive thinking that allowed me to ideate the idea in the first place in a really, really meaningful way. And ultimately to enjoy the fruits of so much time and energy that I'd given to this project. So what are those 4 pillars? So the first pillar, and I really encourage you to, I do this exercise probably once a month whenever I'm feeling stuck within myself. And you can do it individually, you can do it as part of a team. And if you and a group of people are able to commit to living primarily in accordance with these pillars, it's extraordinary what can happen for creativity, vitality, and the execution of impactful ideas. So the first pillar of integrity is radical responsibility. So are you willing to fully own your choices? Are you willing to fully accept that you're the architect of your reality? Are you willing to move beyond blame and victimhood consciousness. Personally, I'm very, very comfortable in victimhood, so it's always work for me to notice that, step out of it, and reclaim my agency by recognizing that I'm the creator of my reality rather than someone else. And that, especially if you're working in a team, this is a absolutely huge one. The second pillar is radical honesty. So are you willing to be radically honest with yourself, perhaps your partner or your partner in the project that you're working on? An extraordinary thing can happen when you make a commitment to honesty, and because ultimately when you're not honest, the first person you're not honest with is yourself, and that immediately creates a disconnection. And an interesting thing happens when we choose to withhold from another. We actually energetically withdraw from them. And if you're collaborating on a project or a business or anything, the moment you have a bunch of thoughts that you don't share, a bunch of your truths, then that conscious choice not to share it means you withdraw from them. And then because we're creatures of confirmation bias, we then project onto them the very thing we didn't share, because we then view them through that lens to confirm the thing that we assumed about them. And very, very quickly you can create an extraordinary level of disconnection in yourself and team just by not being willing to be honest. And it's amazing what happens from a connection point of view, firstly with yourself and others, when you commit to radical candor. So the third pillar of integrity is a really, really important one, and it's a willingness to feel all of your feelings. As a man growing up in a patriarchal society, we're often taught to not do this, and so it's been a lot of personal work over the years to fully allow myself to feel what is alive in me. And when I run this process these days, it's more often than not this one that is actually where I'm stuck. So it's an unwillingness to fully feel my anger, my sadness, my loneliness, whatever it may be. It's very, very quickly it takes me to a place of realizing that there's something that I'm not willing to fully feel. And when I actually allow myself to do that, it's amazing how much aliveness comes back, how much creativity comes back, how much energy comes back, and how much more expansive my thinking is about what is actually possible. And so I think for creativity, I think this one's absolutely essential. And the last one, which is a very important one, is making and keeping impeccable agreements. So do you only make agreements that you actually want to make? When you do make them, do you keep them? And if you can't fulfill them, are you willing to renegotiate them? And I would say that probably 80 to 90% of drama in relationships and in teams happens because of unkept and unclear agreements. And so much energy is wasted, so much distrust is cultivated because people haven't honored their agreements or they weren't clear in the first place. And very, very quickly this can cause a huge amount of energetic drain, impacting creativity and ultimately impacting vitality. And in living these 4 pillars and noticing how much shifts in my life when I actually come back into alignment with myself and my own integrity and my own energetic wholeness, it allows me to relate to any project that I'm doing with more gratitude, more courage in terms of what we can do with that, more connection to it, and ultimately be a better steward for the idea, be a better teammate in something I'm collaborating upon, and ultimately be an infinitely happier person. And so what I realized in this kind of quest to answer the question of who am I without RA was it was never really about, becoming someone new or needing to evolve my identity into something else to fully enjoy this project or enjoy this creation. It was ultimately remembering who I am, why I started this thing in the first place, and why I wanted to be a part of music in the first place. The emotional resonance that music had had to me to the point where I wanted to devote my life to it. That was why I began this project in the first place. And somewhere along the line that had got lost because I was in service of the success that we had created. And that then created this huge amount of distance from the project that I had devoted so much of my life to, which meant that ultimately I couldn't enjoy it in the way that I deserved to. And so I leave you with that. It's just to remember that evolution within oneself, transformation within oneself is not always about becoming someone new. It's not about needing to relate to the project in a different way. It's actually more about how you relate to yourself. And in the spirit of transformation, I think that is a transformational act, because it's easy to lose ourselves in something when we give so much of it. And we, especially when we start to get that external success that validates the thing that we're doing, and then it creates more obligations to more people, it's very easy to lose sight of why we started the thing in the first place. And so this is a moment for me as much as anyone just to remember that it's really about coming back to oneself rather than becoming someone new. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick Seven. That was very inspiring talk.
Thank you.
I can relate so much, and I'm sure many of you also. Thanks for sharing these tools. And I invite you, in 10 minutes, we have the last panel of the day here. It's going to be very exciting, how we can rebuild the future of events as a community. So stick around, and I see you in 10.
Thank you.